Hi, my name is Mina. Welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer, here on Kids Talk Church History.
When 7-year-old Phillis came off a slave ship at Boston, Massachusetts, no one would have imagined that she would become the first African-American woman to have her poems published, and the second published American woman. Her poems helped to change some of the mistaken opinions many people in Europe and the American colonies held about Africans. Stay with us to hear this exciting story. I am Trinity. I am 17 and I live in Charleston, South Carolina.
I am Mina. I am 16 and I live in Kalamazoo, Michigan.
And I'm Priscilla. I'm 11 and I live in Dripping Springs, Texas. She was sold as a slave when she was 7. That's about as old as my little brother Hosea.
Yes, but no one really knows how old Phillis was when she came off the slave ship. But that's what she looked about that age and was missing her front teeth. So they all assumed that she was around 7. So that's what we're assuming too.
I guess they couldn't ask her. I assume she didn't speak English.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how they measured time in her part of Africa and her culture.
I've read that the slaves were packed into tight spaces on ships, and the trip to America took 240 days, which is 8 months. I can't even imagine how it must have felt. What happened after that?
From what I have read in Simonetta Carr's book, Phillis was bought at a slave market in Newport, Rhode Island by a man whose daughter had died a few years earlier when she was 7 as well. And we don't know what Phillis's original name was. I don't think people really cared. And the man who bought her, John Wheatley, called her Phillis because that was the name of the ship that brought her to America.
It seems that the Wheatleys might have treated her well.
Yes, it could have definitely been worse. John's wife, Susanna, taught Phillis how to read and to write, something that few slave owners did. John and Susanna had 2 older children, 18-year-old twins, Nathaniel and Mary. Mary was probably the one who taught Phillis the most.
And then she started to write poetry.
Yes, and she wrote her first poem when she was around 11 years old.
Wow, in 4 years she went from no knowledge of English to writing poems.
Yes, and they weren't just little nursery rhymes that she wrote. They were serious poems with references to the Greek and Latin literature that she had been studying.
And she also studied the Bible.
Yes, in a poem she wrote when she was around 12, she explained that while Greek and Latin literature can teach some virtues, eternal life is found only in Christ.
So how did she become famous?
Well, in 1767, when Phillis was about 13 years old, Susanna arranged for one of her poems to be published in the local newspaper. So she started to be known. But I think the poem that started her fame was the one that she wrote about John Whitefield just after his death.
Whitefield was a famous preacher, right?
Yes, he was a British preacher who was very famous in America. In her poem, Phillis praised him for preaching the gospel to all, Americans and Africans alike, because she said that Christ is an impartial savior. She wrote, "We Americans," showing that she thought the people who had been brought there from Africa were just as American as those who had come from Europe. This poem was noticed by many, even in England, especially by a famous British noblewoman, Selina Hastings, who had been supporting evangelists in England and America. After this, John and Susanna started to think about publishing a book with 28 of Phillis's poems.
But I've read that it was difficult to get them published.
Yes. If getting published is difficult now, back then it was even more so because books were much more expensive and publishers were especially careful about what books they printed. They needed signatures from people who promised to buy the book. I think in Phillis's case, they wanted 300 signatures, and getting them was a huge problem because people couldn't believe that a teenage slave could write such beautiful English poetry.
They thought that Susanna or Mary wrote them instead.
Yeah, and that's not just because of Phillis's age. At that time, a lot of people thought that Africans had inferior abilities. I mean, a lot of famous and influential people like Thomas Jefferson, they made it all sound scientific, so people believed it. Eventually, however, a group of men tested Phillis and became convinced that the poems that she wrote were really her work. She eventually traveled to England and got them published there. There's so much more to say about Phillis Wheatley. I've just been going through the book I've read, but we have here a wonderful expert who can tell us so much more. Professor Vincent Carretta, who is a professor emeritus of English at the University of Maryland and author of many books, including Phillis Wheatley, Biography of a Genius, and Bondage. Professor Carretta, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So you've heard us describe Phillis Wheatley's earlier years until her poems were first recognized. Can you tell us how they were finally published?
Well, in the case of Phillis Wheatley, as in the case of many people during her period, the word published, we would have to define more broadly, because if we mean printed, that's one thing, but published meaning circulated, shared with other readers. She was circulating her poems in that sense of publication when by 1766, when she was very young, barely a teenager, not even a teenager actually, she started circulating her poems. Her first printed poem, it's the one that you referred to earlier, that was published and printed in 1767, and as you mentioned, was probably through Susanna Wheatley's connection. Susanna Wheatley was part of a transatlantic evangelical network. Susanna was a Congregationalist, but she had evangelical connections with Presbyterians, with Anglicans, and so it was a ecumenical evangelical network. And so probably through Susanna, Phillis got that first poem published. She was maybe 14 years old, as I know that I never published anything when I was 14. But it was published in Rhode Island, even though Phillis lived in Boston. It was republished in the Boston newspaper a few weeks later in 1767. But then she continued to publish by manuscript circulation poems between that printed poem and the next one, which again, as you mentioned, was her poem, her elegy on the death of Reverend George Whitefield. And that was in 1770, and that brought her tremendous transatlantic recognition. What she did, again, she's maybe 17 at this point, and she sent a letter to the Countess of Huntingdon, who was probably the wealthiest woman in the British Empire, not counting the Queen, say, because she was a widow. She inherited all of these, the land, the mines that her husband had. And she sponsored a kind of network of evangelical ministers that she sent to the North American colonies. George Whitefield was perhaps the best known one of those, and he made 7 missionary tours of the colonies during his lifetime. He died in 1770 during the last of those missionary tours. In previous tours, and on that last tour, he preached in Phillis's church, so she certainly knew him. He probably stayed with the Wheatleys when he was in Boston to preach in her church. But what Phillis did was to send a letter accompanying the poem that she wrote to George Whitefield's patron, the Countess of Huntingdon. Now imagine the Countess of Huntingdon's getting this poem and this letter from this enslaved teenage girl that she's never heard of. And of course, Phillis is somewhat apologetic about sending this. She says, I'm sort of daring to send this to you. This is not something that was done in the 18th century. You didn't initiate a correspondence with someone, especially a social superior like this. This is a really daring move to make. But how did she have that connection? Susanna Wheatley was a correspondent of the Countess of Huntingdon. So again, it was probably almost certainly through the Susanna Wheatley connection to Huntingdon that Phillis was able to send this letter in the poem. And as you all pointed out, there was a lot of suspicion about could this teenage enslaved girl write a poem like this. And so one of the things that the Countess did is she sent representatives to Boston to interrogate Phillis, to ask Phillis to write something in their presence, to read something in their presence, also to attest to Phillis's piety. All of these things because the Countess of Huntingdon was very curious about this person who was obviously making a gesture towards hoping to get the Countess's patronage and support. And so this went on for a couple of years that we had Phillis being interviewed, we would say, by various people. Meanwhile, Phillis is writing more poems that she's distributing through the manuscript circulation to various women, to various recipients of other elegies, poems on the deaths of various relatives. So Phillis is pretty well known in the Boston area. Her owners were prominent business people, prominent members of the political and social society of Boston. Remember, Boston's only about 15,000 people total at this period. So when you divide up, okay, half of those male, say, how many of those were enslaved, how many of those are prosperous, so that the social circle was small enough that the Wheatleys also entertained people. So a lot of people came into contact with Phillis personally, as well as through her writings. And so by 1772, Phillis had written enough poems that the Wheatleys, and we again assume it was primarily Susanna Wheatley, promoted this notion of, well, let's see if we can get enough subscribers to sign up in advance to publish a book of Phillis Wheatley's poems. And now there's some dispute as to whether they failed to get those numbers of people or whether they decided, well, rather than try to publish in this basically provincial little town of 15,000 people, why don't we go for the big prize and see if we can get it published in London, which it says this time 750,000 people. It was the largest city in the Western world by far. It's where you dreamt of getting published, if possible. So Susanna wrote to the Countess of Huntingdon. The Countess of Huntingdon asked to see the manuscript. She was sent the manuscript. They lined up a publisher in London who was willing to publish the book, to take a risk on publishing the book without getting subscribers in advance. And the Countess said, well, I would like to see a frontispiece, have a portrait of her included in this book, which is another way of sort of giving evidence that Phillis was who she was and what she looked like. And we can talk more about the book itself if you want. But that's basically how she got published. It's through these connections, mainly through women patrons. First Susanna Wheatley, then the Countess of Huntingdon. So it's really an astounding tale of how this young, and again, by the time the book is published in 1773, she's maybe 20 years old.
Right. You mentioned that she traveled to London or to England, and during that time they didn't have slavery there. Why did she choose to return to America while still enslaved, even though she couldn't be forced to do so under English law?
Well, under English law, slavery was not outlawed yet in England. In Slavery was never legal or illegal in England. There was no law about slavery in England because there were relatively few enslaved people in England. It wasn't like the colonies, where the colonies had laws specifically about slavery, regarding slavery. What had happened in England is in 1772, the year before Phillis went to England, and Phillis was sent to England as part of a publicity campaign, a pre-publication campaign. But in 1772, Lord Mansfield, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, the highest judicial position, ruled that no enslaved person brought to England could legally be forced back to the colonies as a slave. And so it was popularly interpreted to mean that you couldn't be enslaved in England. But technically, that's not what it meant. It just meant that you couldn't be forced back into slavery in the colonies. And so this was widely known. It was published in the colonial newspapers in 1772. And we know Phillis was an avid reader of newspapers. She published her poems in the newspapers, in the Boston newspapers. But in these colonial newspapers, slave owners were warned explicitly, oh, because of this Mansfield decision, don't bring your slaves to England because you can't force them to go back. They can run away in England and then you lose control of them. And they'll have sympathizers in England who will protect them, take them in. And one of the people, well, not one of the leading person who brought the case before Mansfield was named Granville Sharp. And Granville Sharp was seen as a heroic figure by the Black population, not just in England, but throughout the colonies. Now, one of the people that Phillis met and spent time with in England was Granville Sharp. In fact, he was her tour guide at the Tower of London because he had his office there. And so Phillis, in a remarkable letter of October 1773, just weeks after she had returned, tells her correspondent she had been freed at the desire of her friends in England. And at the top of that list would be Granville Sharp. And what I think happened is that Phillis said to her owner, to Nathaniel Wheatley, who had accompanied her, this was the son of Susanna and John Wheatley, who had accompanied her to London. She said, okay, you give me your word that I will be free if I go back. Otherwise, I stay here because that's an option. And I'm being well received here. She was wined and dined, treated like a celebrity. She was an exotic celebrity. And she was taken toured all over London, including the British Museum and various other sites, many of which are still major tourist sites today in London. And so I think what happened is she basically manipulated her owners by saying, I'll go back only if I'm guaranteed you give your word of honor in front of all these witnesses that I be freed if I do so. And she was freed within weeks or immediately after, but certainly within weeks of returning. So she had control at that point of whether she would be freed or not.
All right. Can you briefly tell us what happened to Phillis after she returned to America?
Well, after she returned, of course, She was waiting for her books to be delivered. They got delayed by the Boston Tea Party because her books were on one of the ships that was commandeered by the people opposed to the Boston tea tax. And so it took about a month longer for the books to arrive. She immediately started transition from being this young girl to this businesswoman, signing copies of the book so that she would get the profits from the copies, the authorized copies that were sold. Susanna Wheatley died in February of 1774. Almost less than a month later, part of a letter that Phillis wrote to a Presbyterian Native American minister was published in the newspaper, and it's her most directly anti-slavery statement that exists. So she waited until, or they waited until Susanna Wheatley died. I don't think it was just a coincidence before a most anti-slavery position was published. And so Phillis was very actively selling her book. She, as she's said to her correspondent, now she's upon her own footing. Now that she's freed, she's expected to take care of her own welfare. She doesn't have a slave owner to count on for room and board unless she's working for them. She probably continued working for John Wheatley as his secretary, writing his letters, taking his dictation, we would say. And she was also continued to write poems and publish poems after 1773, after she got back.
You've written a lot of books about early Americans or African Americans. When did you first become interested in the subject and how?
I'll try to give you the shorter answer on that. I don't know if you know how academia works. As a profession, you have to do a certain amount of publication usually to get tenure, and then when you get so you become promoted to an associate professor, and then the next promotion is to a full professor, and usually that takes even more publications. And so when I became a full professor, you have the choice. You can either keep working on what you've been working on, and I have been working on verbal and visual political satire in English on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean in the 18th century. So I could have continued doing that, which is sort of a safe way of going. Dig deeper into what you know. It's safe, but it risks being boring. The other alternative was to do something you haven't done before, which can be exciting, but scary. Because you can say, well, I don't know. Will I have anything to say? Also, it requires a little bit of setup research. What's known and what's not known. Now, of these writers who were writing in English, people of African descent, I noticed that the people who were publishing on them tended to be people who were basically specialists in American literature. And I had been a specialist in British literature. But most of these people of African descent who were published in the 18th century were publishing in London. And I said, well, London's pretty far east for an American. So why is this the case? And did these people self-identify as African American or as African British, which at that period, this is in the late 1980s, 1990s, which wasn't really much of a field. You didn't have many people say, well, I work in African British literature. It's much more so now, or people are even more comfortable, as I am, talking about transatlantic literature by people of African descent, because these are people who were denied citizenship on either side of the Atlantic. So they become kind of cosmopolitan figures, citizens of the world, you might say, self-described and self-identified. And so I thought, okay, let me dig deeply and see what I can find out about some of these people. And the first one I worked on was Olona Equiano, who published his autobiography in 1789 in London. But almost everyone who had written about him wrote about him from an Americanist perspective. He never identified himself as what we would call American. In fact, his description of his experience in North America was always really negative. Uh, his experiences with slavery in Georgia, for example. He was never enslaved in Georgia. He was, most of his enslaved life, he spent involved in the British Navy. So that's how I began.
That's really cool. And it also seems that Phillis was very close to the Wheatley family, especially to Susanna, but she was convinced that slavery was wrong. How did Phillis reconcile her beliefs about slavery with her affection for the Wheatleys? And was it uncommon for Africans to be close to the people who held them as slaves?
That's a huge question.
It is.
With lots of layers. Well, Phillis, the relationship between Phillis and Susanna Wheatley was complicated because Phillis was bought when she was about 7. She is, of course, stripped of her family relationship. She comes to America. She doesn't speak English. She's purchased by Susanna Wheatley. Phillis is too young to be of much labor use. She'd have to be taught everything, how to sew, for example, all of these kind of domestic skills. Susanna Wheatley had lost a daughter almost 10 years to the month that that John Wheatley bought Phillis to give to Susanna Wheatley. And the daughter that died, the gravestone that Susanna Wheatley erected for the daughter who died has her life. Usually we see on a gravestone the birth year, maybe the day and month of the birth and the day and the month of the death, right? Well, on this gravestone, it has the number of months, years, months, and days that this daughter died at almost the same age as the age that Phillis is purchased, and almost 10 years after. So psychologically, I've suggested that Phillis may have been this replacement daughter. Phillis writes to correspondents after Susanna's death, saying that I feel as though I've lost a parent, a mother, that Susanna was a maternal figure to Phillis, which would not be surprising at all, given whether you want to be really kind of negative and say the Stockholm syndrome, something that Phillis identifies with her captors, or the fact that Phillis was treated in an extraordinary way by Susanna Wheatley, given all of these uh, educational opportunities. And now Susanna Wheatley, as an evangelical, I should say, felt obligated to expose Phillis to literacy so she could read the Bible, so she'd be exposed to the Bible. But they quickly learned that, wow, this girl is a child prodigy. I mean, she's not just reading the Bible; she started to try to write and everything. And this looks good for Susanna, because it shows Susanna is the kind of ideal slave owner, because she has evangelized her enslaved person. But this was an extraordinary example of a slave owner enslaved person relationship, because we think of domestic slavery could be really oppressive for the enslaved person, because that person's always under surveillance if they're living in the house, and which we often don't think about. So Phillis was in an extraordinary relationship with her owner, and there seems to be true affection between Susanna Wheatley and Phillis.
Yeah, so at one point it seemed that Phillis was invited to go to Africa as a missionary. So why did she refuse that?
She was actually invited and encouraged several times, and by different people on both sides of the Atlantic. Even before she became famous, a Presbyterian minister who corresponded with Susanna Wheatley suggested having her sent to Africa as a missionary. This was very early in Phillis's life, because she showed such devotion, such piety. And he acknowledged in this letter to Susanna, he said, well, okay, there aren't really male ministers, but the Quakers had female preachers. And so that would be a kind of a model to send her to Africa as. And nothing happened with that. But once Phillis published her book after 1774, a couple of people, one on each side of the Atlantic, encouraged Phillis to go to Africa as a missionary, or to accompany missionaries of African descent, even to marry one and go as his spouse. Now, at this point, Phillis, of course, has gained some significant fame as a published author after her book had been published. And so she's making some money on that. She's got a lot of celebrity. So she had personal reasons not to want to go. And she, of course, her letters, her responses to these encouragements are interesting, because she has to, she's both firm in saying no, but she also has to not offend these white men who are both ministers, who are encouraging her to go. And one, she says, and then they're encouraging her to go to a part of Africa that she certainly didn't come from. And we have to remember, in the 18th century, most white people thought Africa was a country. There was one country called Africa, and there was one language called African. And so she wrote back to one of them, well, I'm sure it would be wonderful to be sent, but I don't speak the language of this place. I don't know anybody. Basically, it wouldn't be really appropriate for me to be sent. So she had personal and professional reasons not to want to be sent to Africa, but she also had legitimate spiritual reasons not to want to be sent to Africa. Why would she want to go as somebody's spouse to a place where she knew no one and had no way to make contact with people? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Dr. Carretta, we are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And listeners, keep telling us what you think of these episodes and keep asking questions. We'll pass them on to our guest experts as soon as possible. And for the opportunity to win a copy of Simonetta Carr's biography for kids about Phillis Wheatley, visit our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, and enter the drawing. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, on behalf of my co-hosts, Mina and Priscilla, I am Trinity. Thank you so much for listening to Kids Talk Church History.